She sat in the back of the ballroom while the man who promised to love her married her stepmother. No tears, no trembling hands, no broken voice. Just Charlotte Whitmore, spine straight, jaw tight, watching the two people who destroyed her life exchange vows beneath chandeliers that her family's money helped pay for. Everyone in that room expected her to shatter. She had different plans. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with everything, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ballroom smelled like money and lies. Charlotte had known that smell her entire life. White flowers cut before they could fully bloom, French perfume layered thick enough to cover something rotten underneath, the faint metallic bite of champagne poured into crystal that cost more than most people made in a month. She had grown up breathing that air, learning to smile inside it, learning to move through rooms like this one as if she belonged to them, and they belonged to her. She no longer believed that. She sat in a chair near the rear exit, a glass of water untouched on the table beside her, and she watched Victoria Caldwell walk down the center aisle of the Blackwood Estates' grand ballroom in a gown that probably cost $40,000. The dress was ivory, fitted at the waist, with a long train that whispered against the marble floor. Victoria moved the way she always moved, like she had rehearsed the moment for years. Steady, deliberate, composed, which she had. Charlotte now knew exactly how many years. Nathaniel Ashford stood at the far end of the aisle, and he looked the way he always looked when he was performing for an audience, jaw set, shoulders back, eyes arranged into something that resembled sincerity. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly because he had it made by a tailor in Milan who charged by the hour. His hair was combed, his expression was controlled. He looked like a man who had made a reasonable decision and was comfortable with it. Charlotte studied him the way she might study a document she was preparing to shred. She had not come tonight to make a scene. She had come because she needed to see it with her own eyes, and because she needed Nathaniel to know she had seen it. There was a difference between hearing that something had happened and sitting 10 feet from the wreckage. The difference mattered. It would matter more in the months ahead. Nobody approached her. A few people glanced her way. She caught the looks, the small uncomfortable flickers, the quick redirections of attention. The Whitmore name still carried weight in this city, even with her father 2 years in the ground and his estate carved up by Victoria's careful hands. People remembered the name. They were simply unsure, at this particular moment, what posture to take toward the woman attached to it. Charlotte didn't help them figure it out. She sat still and watched the ceremony begin. The officiant spoke in the measured cadence of a man who had done this 100 times and charged accordingly. He said things about commitment and partnership and the courage it took to stand before the people you loved and make a promise. Charlotte's jaw tightened once. She allowed herself that. Then she smoothed her expression back into something flat and watchable and continued paying attention. Victoria reached Nathaniel. He took her hands. He looked at her the way he used to look at Charlotte, or what Charlotte had believed was the way he looked at her. She understood now that she had been reading the performance wrong for years. The look was not love, it was ownership. It was the specific satisfaction a man felt when something he had decided to want was finally within his grip. Victoria smiled back at him, and the smile was real, which was the part Charlotte found most instructive. Victoria was not pretending to love him. She genuinely did, or something close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was that none of it had started as love. It had started as strategy, and it had evolved. And Victoria had never once seen any reason to feel guilty about that evolution because in Victoria Caldwell's accounting system, the only currency that mattered was position. Charlotte had taken a long time to understand this. She still wasn't entirely certain she understood it the way she needed to. She left before the reception. The night air outside the Blackwood estate hit her like a hand pressed flat against the chest, cold, direct, pushing back. Late October in New York had its own particular quality of darkness, the kind that settled into the spaces between the street lamps and made everything feel more serious than it probably was. She stood on the stone steps for a moment with her coat unbuttoned, just breathing, letting the cold work its way through the fabric of her dress. A car idled at the bottom of the drive. Her driver, Marcus, a man who had worked for the Whitmore family for 14 years and who had never once asked her a personal question she didn't invite, sat with his eyes facing forward. She walked down to the car, got in, and sat with her hands folded in her lap as they pulled away. "Home?" Marcus said. "Not yet," Charlotte said. "Drive." He drove. She watched the city move past the windows, and she thought about the first time she had learned that something was wrong. It had been a Tuesday in April, 6 months ago. She and Nathaniel had been living in his apartment on the Upper East Side, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows and an art collection chosen by a decorator who had never met him. Charlotte had gone back to pick up a jacket she'd left behind, and Nathaniel had been in the shower, and his phone had been on the kitchen counter, and a message had arrived from a contact saved only as V. She hadn't meant to read it. She had glanced at the screen because it was there, and the first line was already visible, and the first line was enough. Last night was everything. Don't lose your nerve now. We're so close. She had stood in that kitchen for a long time. The shower was still running. She could hear it. She had picked up her jacket, folded it over her arm, and left the apartment before Nathaniel came out of the bathroom. She had sat in the back of a cab for 20 minutes before she was able to form a clear thought. And the clear thought, when it came, was not about Nathaniel at all. It was about Victoria. Because Charlotte had known, in that first suspended moment of reading those words, exactly who V was. Not because she had proof, not because the logic was complete, but because somewhere beneath the months of careful normality, some part of her had already filed the observation without naming it. The way Victoria and Nathaniel moved in a room together, the particular quality of their silences, the specific texture of Victoria's smile when Nathaniel's name came up in conversation. She had known, and she had not let herself know. That was the thing she found hardest to forgive herself for. The investigation that followed was not emotional. Charlotte had made a decision, standing in that cab, that emotion was a resource she could not afford to spend carelessly. She was not a woman who had ever lacked for control. It was the quality that had made her good at her work, and difficult to live with, according to Nathaniel, who had said those exact words to her on more than one occasion with the tone of a man delivering a useful observation. She had accepted that framing for too long. She did not accept it anymore. She hired a private investigator named Gail, who came recommended by an attorney she trusted and who asked no unnecessary questions. She began reviewing her father's estate documents, which she had not done carefully enough in the 18 months since his death, because she had trusted Victoria to handle the administrative matters the way a person trusted a stepmother who had spent 4 years presenting herself as competent and devoted. What she found in those documents was not what she expected. The Whitmore estate had been managed through a series of investment vehicles and property trusts, and on the surface the paperwork was clean. But there were signatures, dates, the pattern of decisions made in the 18 months before her father's death, when he had been ill and declining and largely dependent on Victoria to navigate the complexity of his financial affairs. The decisions were legal. They were also, Charlotte came to understand, arranged. Victoria had positioned herself as the primary beneficiary of the estate's most liquid assets, not through fraud exactly, but through the patient, methodical exploitation of a grieving man's trust. Gail confirmed the affair in 11 days. Photographs, hotel records, the particular architecture of two people who had been careful but not careful enough, Nathaniel and Victoria. 6 months before Charlotte saw that message on his phone, and by Gail's estimate, the relationship had begun well before that. Charlotte sat with the photographs for one evening. She allowed herself the full weight of it. She cried once, briefly, into a glass of cold water, and she found the sensation less like grief and more like pressure releasing from somewhere she hadn't known was sealed. Then she put the photographs in a folder, set the folder in a locked drawer, and went back to work. Nathaniel came to her 3 weeks later, at the apartment she had moved into after leaving his place, and he told her he was ending their engagement. He said it the way he said most things, with the confidence of a man who believed his decisions, once made, were essentially reasonable, and that the people affected by them should be able to recognize their reasonableness if they were mature enough to try. He said she was too driven. He said she had always been difficult to reach. He said Victoria understood him in a way that Charlotte, despite her intelligence, had never quite managed. Charlotte listened to all of it, She did not show him the photographs. She did not tell him what she knew. She asked him one question when he was finished. Is this what you want, Nathaniel? Or is this what Victoria decided you wanted? He looked at her then with something she couldn't quite classify. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Some recognition that moved through him and then sealed over. He left without answering. She watched him go and understood that the question had landed. She also understood that the answer would never come, because Nathaniel Ashford was a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who made his decisions easier, and he had simply traded one of those people for another. That was the month she started looking into the Ashford family history. She didn't expect what she found. The Ashford fortune, the shipping interest, the real estate portfolio, the financial holdings that had made the family a fixture at every significant table in New York for 3 decades, had an origin that didn't match the official account. The official account was imprecise in the way that family mythologies tended to be, all selective detail and convenient omission. The Ashfords talked about their grandfather's vision, their father's expansion, the particular genius of the family for identifying opportunity. They did not talk about where the original capital had come from or who had provided the infrastructure that made their first significant deals possible. Charlotte found references that didn't connect, and she pulled on the threads. And after 6 weeks of work, she found a name that appeared twice in documents that were not supposed to exist and should not have been accessible to her, but were, because she had paid someone who had once worked for the company that had handled the Ashford family's document archiving in the mid-90s, and had, at some point, made a copy of certain files for reasons that were never specified. The name was Blackwood. She sat with that name for a week before she was able to confirm what it meant. Dominic Blackwood was not a man who appeared in conventional research. There were no profiles, no interviews, no confirmed photographs more recent than 15 years ago. What existed was inference and reputation, the accumulated knowledge of people who knew the city's hidden geography, the way underground money moved through legitimate structures, who controlled what and through which arrangements. Charlotte was not naive about this world. Her father had been a businessman in New York for 40 years and had operated with his eyes open. She had learned from him. What she was able to piece together, slowly and carefully, over the course of 3 months, was this. Dominic Blackwood had, in the early 1990s, provided the Ashford family with the capital and the connections that made their first major shipping deal possible. The arrangement had been structured to keep his name invisible, a requirement, presumably, given the nature of the money and the nature of the man. The Ashfords had grown their empire on the foundation he built, and at some point they had decided the foundation was inconvenient to acknowledge. The story of what happened next was harder to reconstruct. There were pieces, references to a legal dispute, a forced separation, a restructuring of relationships that left Dominic Blackwood without formal claims on the businesses his resources had created. There were also references to his own family, to children who had aligned themselves with the Ashfords during the dispute, to a kind of internal betrayal that Charlotte found, when she read it, almost too structured to believe. But she had learned, in the last 6 months, not to underestimate the organized cruelty of which people were capable when money and position were at stake. She found one additional piece of information that surprised her. Dominic Blackwood, in the years since his disappearance from the city's visible power structure, had been quietly funding a series of medical programs, children's hospitals, research centers, clinics in neighborhoods where the money would never make it into a press release. The funding was routed through layers of legal structure designed to obscure the source. But the source, when you followed it carefully enough, was consistent. Charlotte stared at that information for a long time. She had been looking for a weapon. She had found something more complicated than that. The car stopped at an intersection, and she realized Marcus had been driving in broad circles through the upper half of Manhattan for the better part of an hour. She looked out the window at the city, lit up and moving, indifferent in the specific way that large cities were indifferent, containing everything and explaining nothing. "Take me home," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She rode the rest of the way in silence, her hands still folded, her mind moving through the problem with the kind of steady, deliberate attention she had spent years developing and had once, briefly, allowed herself to stop using. She was not going to make that mistake again. At home, she went to her desk. She opened the folder that contained everything she had compiled on Dominic Blackwood. The financial threads, the timeline, the references, the medical foundation work. She had been building an argument, not an emotional one. An argument in the language that men like Dominic Blackwood understood, which was the language of interest and leverage and the particular value of a person who saw things clearly and was not afraid to act on what they saw. She was going to find him. She was going to sit across from him. And she was going to make him the kind of proposal that a man who had spent 15 years watching the people who betrayed him grow fat on what he built would not be able to refuse. She picked up a pen and wrote one line at the top of a blank page. What he lost. What I can help him take back. What I need in return. She stared at the line. Then she started writing. Outside, the city kept moving. Somewhere across Manhattan, in the ballroom of the Blackwood estate, a place that still carried his name even after everything, Nathaniel Ashford was dancing with the woman he had chosen over her, surrounded by people who did not know. The ground beneath their feet was already shifting. Charlotte wrote for 3 hours without stopping. By the time she set down the pen, she had 12 pages. And she had figured out where Dominic Blackwood was going to be on Thursday morning. Thursday came in cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the city feel smaller than it was. The sky pressing down on the rooftops like something with weight and intention. Charlotte had not slept well. She hadn't expected to. She had lain in the dark for a few hours with her eyes open, running through the sequence of what she was about to do the way a surgeon might rehearse a procedure. Not because she was nervous, exactly, but because the difference between a mistake and a success in situations like this one was preparation. And she had learned that lesson early and did not intend to unlearn it. She was up at 5. Coffee, black. The 12 pages she had written were in a leather portfolio on the desk, and she read through them once while the coffee cooled, making 2 small corrections with a pen. Then she closed the portfolio, showered, dressed in a charcoal wool suit that was serious without performing seriousness, and sat by the window until it was time to leave. The address she had was for a building in the West 40s, a nondescript commercial block that housed, according to public records, a property management company called Meridian Realty Group. Meridian's filings were clean, its principals listed as 2 attorneys whose names appeared in no other significant context. But the building itself, when Charlotte had walked past it 3 days ago on a preliminary pass, had a particular quality she had learned to read. The cameras were positioned wrong for a building that only managed properties. They covered approaches, not entrances. They were watching for who came toward the building, not who came through the door. She arrived at 8:45. She told no one where she was going. She had thought carefully about whether that was reckless and had decided it was a calculated risk she could accept. She pushed through the glass door into a lobby that smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air. A man behind a desk looked up at her, late 30s, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone who had been trained to be still. "Charlotte Whitmore," she said. "I don't have an appointment. I'm here to see Dominic Blackwood. Tell him I have a proposal regarding the Meridian Foundation's pediatric expansion program, and that I know exactly where the funding originates." The man behind the desk did not react the way most people reacted to unexpected information. He held her gaze for a beat, then picked up a phone and said nothing audible into it. She waited. 4 minutes passed. "Third floor," the man said. The elevator was slow. Charlotte stood in it with her portfolio against her side and her breathing even, and she thought about her father, which was not something she had planned to think about. She thought about the way he used to sit across the breakfast table on Sunday mornings, reading the financial section with his reading glasses low on his nose, occasionally reading something out loud that he found interesting. He had been a man who believed in the value of information and the importance of knowing more than the person sitting across from you. He had tried to teach her that. She thought he would have recognized what she was doing today, even if he couldn't have approved of all the details. The elevator opened onto a corridor. A different man stood at the far end of it, older, leaner, with gray at his temples and eyes that moved over her with professional precision. He nodded once and turned, and she followed him through a door and into a room that was not what she had expected. She had expected something that announced power. Instead, the room was spare. A table, 4 chairs, a window with the blinds half down, and on the table a cup of coffee and a folder that was closed. The man behind the table was not looking at her when she came in. He was reading something, and he finished reading it before he looked up. Dominic Blackwood was older than the photographs she had found, which were already 15 years out of date. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, with a face that had been weathered without being softened, deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that still held its structure, gray hair cut close. He was wearing a dark shirt, no tie, no jewelry. His hands on the table were the hands of a man who had done physical work at some point in his life and whose body still remembered it. He looked at her without expression. "Sit down," he said. His voice was lower than she'd anticipated, with a slight roughness to it, like a car engine that had been running a long time. She sat. "You want to tell me how you found this address?" he said. It was not a question. "I followed the foundation funding through 3 layers of legal structure and cross-referenced the property filings with utility billing records from 2019, Charlotte said. "The Meridian name appears in both. It took me about 6 weeks. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. Something more like assessment. "That's a problem," he said. "For whoever set up the structure, yes. Not for me. I'm not here to expose anything. I'm here to offer you something." People who come to me with offers usually want something that costs more than they're willing to say. "I'll say it directly," Charlotte said. "I want to take down the Ashford family. Not damage them, dismantle them. I know you have reason to want the same thing. I know the history. I know what they built on, and I know what they erased. And I have access to certain documentation that you may not have, and that could make the legal dimensions of this considerably easier." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man who had spent decades making decisions in rooms where mistakes were permanent. "How old are you?" Dominic said. 29. "And you think you know the Ashford history?" "I know the part that was deliberately buried, the 1993 capital arrangement, the restructuring in 1997, the forced separation." She paused. "And I know about your children." His expression didn't change, but something in the air of the room did. A shift in pressure, almost physical. "You're either very brave," he said, "or very stupid." "I've been told I'm difficult to read on that question." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee, drank from it, set it back down. "Tell me about the documentation," he said. She opened the portfolio. She talked for 40 minutes. He interrupted her twice, once to ask a specific question about a date, once to correct an assumption she had made about the structure of the 1997 arrangement, which she noted and accepted. He did not perform interest. He simply listened with the quality of attention that she associated with people who had learned, the hard way, that information was the only thing that consistently held its value. When she was finished, he sat back. "Why the Ashfords specifically?" he said. "The foundation connection I can accept as a research path. But why this particular target?" "Nathaniel Ashford was my fiancé," Charlotte said. "He ended our engagement to marry my stepmother. My stepmother spent 4 years embedded in my family's finances before my father died, and the arrangements she made in the last year of his illness reduced my inheritance significantly. The legal structure was clean. The intent was not." She kept her voice level. "I am not here because I'm heartbroken. I'm here because I understand now that the Ashford family and Victoria Caldwell operated the same way. They identified what someone had built, got close enough to benefit from it, and then removed the person who built it. You know what that method looks like. I thought you might find the parallel instructive." Dominic Blackwood was quiet for a moment. "You walked into my building," he said, "found my address through records that should not have been findable, sat down across from me without knowing whether I would let you leave, and pitched me a partnership based on the argument that we've both been stolen from." He tilted his head slightly. "That's either a prepared speech or you actually believe it." "Both," Charlotte said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it was in the vicinity. "Leave the documentation," he said. "I'll have it reviewed. The originals stay with me. You can review copies." He looked at her. "All right," he said. She extracted the copies she had prepared. She had prepared them. She had anticipated this exchange and set them on the table. She closed the portfolio. She stood. "How do I reach you?" she said. "You don't. I reach you." He glanced at the copies on the table. If what you brought me is what you say it is. She nodded and left. In the elevator going down, she let out a slow breath and pressed her hand flat against the wall for a moment, not because she was afraid, but because the meeting had demanded a sustained quality of control that had its own physical cost, and her body knew it even when her mind refused to. She walked out onto the street and the cold hit her again, and she kept walking. He called 4 days later. Not a number she recognized. She answered anyway because she had been waiting for 4 days in a state of controlled tension that had expressed itself as extra hours at the consulting work she still maintained, extra coffee, and one night of sitting at her desk at 2 in the morning, reading through her father's financial records for the 4th time, looking for anything she had missed. "The documentation is legitimate," Dominic said. No greeting. "There are 2 items I want clarified." "Tell me." He named them. She answered both. There was a silence. "Come back Thursday," he said. 8 in the morning. He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she set it down and went back to work. The second meeting was different. He was standing when she came in, at the window with the blinds up this time, looking out at the street below. He turned when she entered, but didn't move to the table immediately. He looked like a man who had spent 4 days doing his own research and had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. "Sit down," he said, but he said it differently than the first time. Less like an instruction, more like an invitation. She sat. He came to the table and sat across from her. "I want to know about the medical foundation," Charlotte said, "not the legal structure. Why?" He looked at her. "That's not relevant to what you came here to discuss." "I think it is. I think a man who spent 15 years being erased from the history of everything he built, and who chose, in that time, to quietly fund children's hospitals without putting his name on it, is a different kind of person than the reputation suggests. And the kind of person he is matters to me, because I'm considering whether to trust him." The silence stretched. "My youngest daughter," Dominic said finally, "was sick when she was 7. For about a year, it was not clear she would survive it. She did." He paused. "The hospital that treated her was in a neighborhood where most of the families couldn't cover the cost of what she received. I watched that for a year." He stopped. "That's all?" Charlotte held his gaze. "Thank you," she said quietly. Something shifted between them. Not warmth exactly, but a change in the quality of the distance. "The Ashford documentation gives me legal traction I've been looking for 12 years, Dominic said. "With the right attorney and the right timing, I can initiate a claim that would force a full audit of their original capital structure. If that audit happens, the empire they built on my foundation becomes contestable." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want from that process?" "Victoria's financial arrangements with my father's estate made public and legally challenged, and Nathaniel—" She stopped. "I don't want him destroyed. I want him to understand what he had and what he chose to throw away. I want the name Ashford to mean something different in this city than it does right now." "That's not the same as destroying them." "No," Charlotte agreed. "It's worse." Dominic looked at her for a long moment, and this time the almost smile completed itself slightly. "You're going to be difficult to work with," he said. "I've been told that. In this context, it might be an asset." They spent the next 3 hours working through the structure of what she was proposing. Dominic moved through the legal and financial architecture with the fluency of someone who had spent decades thinking about how power was built and transferred and defended. And Charlotte followed him without difficulty, pushing back twice where she disagreed and accepting his correction twice where she was wrong. By the time they finished, the shape of something real was on the table between them. She was putting the portfolio back together when the door opened. The man who came in was younger than Dominic by 30 years, with the Blackwood jawline and his father's eyes set in a face that had been carefully composed into something neutral. He stopped when he saw Charlotte. "I didn't know you had company," the man said. "Marcus," Dominic said, and his voice had changed, not softer, but more careful. "This is Charlotte Whitmore. We're finishing a meeting." Marcus Blackwood looked at Charlotte with the specific quality of attention that she recognized as threat assessment dressed as curiosity. He was well-dressed, well-maintained, and his body in the doorway was positioned with an awareness that she suspected was not accidental. "What kind of meeting?" Marcus said. "The kind that doesn't concern you yet," Dominic said. Something passed between the two men, a charge that had history in it, old and accumulated. Marcus's jaw tightened fractionally. "The attorney's called," Marcus said. "The Delacroix filing. There's a timing question." "I'll call them this afternoon." Marcus looked at Charlotte once more. "Nice to meet you," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite, and left. Charlotte waited until the door closed. "Your son." "Yes." "He's aligned with the Ashfords." The silence that followed was answer enough. "He doesn't know what you're doing," Charlotte said. "No." She looked at him carefully. "Does he know about the documentation I brought you?" "No one knows you were here," Dominic said. "That needs to remain true." "Then we have a timeline problem," Charlotte said. "If Marcus is in contact with the Ashford legal team and the Delacroix filing creates any movement that alerts them, they'll start covering exposure. We have maybe 6 weeks before anything I gave you becomes harder to use." Dominic's expression had gone somewhere she couldn't read. "I'm aware," he said. "Are you willing to move against your own son's interests to do this?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. Dominic Blackwood looked at the table for a moment, and when he looked back up at her, his face had the specific quality of a man who had made a decision he had been moving toward for a long time, and had only now allowed himself to complete. "Marcus made his choice 12 years ago," he said. "He made it knowing what it would cost." His voice was level and carried no performance of pain, but the pain was in it anyway, underneath, the way structural damage lived in a building that still looked sound from the outside. "I've been patient. That's finished now." Charlotte held his gaze. "Then we need to move in the next 2 weeks," she said. "Not 6. "I know." And Dominic, it was the first time she had used his name, and she watched him register it. "Marcus is going to find out. Whatever we build, he will find out. And when he does, he'll go directly to Nathaniel Ashford. We need to be past the point where that matters before it happens." Dominic was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "There's something else," he said. "Tell me." "Victoria Caldwell," he said. "She's not just an opportunist who attached herself to the Ashford name. Before your father, there was a family in Boston. Before that, a man in Chicago who lost his company and died 2 years later without being able to explain to anyone how it had happened." He looked at her steadily. "She's done this before. She's very good at it. And she knows by now that you didn't fall apart the way she expected." Charlotte's hands were flat on the table. She kept them still. "How do you know this?" she said. "Because when you left 4 days ago, I had someone look into her," Dominic said. "You came here with documentation about the Ashfords. What you brought me about Victoria was personal. I wanted to know if it was also structural." "And?" "It's structural," he said. "She has a pattern. She's protected by it because no one has ever connected the cases. They're in different cities, different families, different legal contexts." He paused. "Until now." Charlotte sat with that for a moment. The room was very quiet. "If she finds out we're connecting them," Charlotte said, "she'll move. She'll liquidate whatever she took from my father's estate before we can freeze it, and she'll use Nathaniel's legal resources to create enough noise that the Ashford exposure gets delayed past the window." "Yes." "So we need to move on both of them simultaneously." "Yes." "In 2 weeks." "Yes." Charlotte looked at him across the table and felt, for the first time since that Tuesday in April, when she had stood in Nathaniel's kitchen reading a message that wasn't meant for her, something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fury but lived in the same territory as both. "All right," she said. "Then I need to tell you something I haven't told you yet." Dominic waited. "There's a man in the Ashford legal team," Charlotte said. "His name is Peter Vance. He's been with the family for 9 years. He has a reason to want out of that arrangement that has nothing to do with me. And 3 weeks ago, he made indirect contact through a mutual connection, suggesting he might be willing to provide documentation about the internal financial structure that no outside investigation could ever access." Dominic's eyes sharpened. "You've been holding that," he said. "I was waiting to see if you were who I thought you were." The silence stretched between them, and in it something settled. Not comfort, but the particular weight of two people who had each been, in their different ways, alone with a problem for a very long time, and who had just found, for the first time, that the problem had a shape that two people could hold between them. "Call Vance," Dominic said. "Tonight," Charlotte said. She stood and picked up her portfolio and walked to the door, and she had her hand on the frame when Dominic spoke again. "Charlotte," she turned. "Marcus is going to move faster than you think," he said. "He was in that doorway for a reason. He already suspects something." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "Then we don't have 2 weeks," she said. "No," Dominic said. "We have days." She held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked out into the corridor, and the door closed behind her. And somewhere across the city in a midtown law office, a man named Peter Vance was sitting at a desk surrounded by files that contained the buried history of everything the Ashford family had built and hidden and lied about for 30 years. And he didn't yet know that tonight his phone was going to ring, and the person on the other end was going to offer him the one thing he had spent 9 years believing he would never find. A way out that wasn't also a way down. Peter Vance picked up on the third ring. Charlotte was standing at her kitchen window when he answered, looking out at the street below where a delivery truck was double parked and a cab was trying to get around it. The cab driver's hand on the horn in short, controlled bursts that expressed frustration without committing to it. She had been watching the street for 10 minutes before she made the call, not because she needed to think about whether to make it, but because the act of watching something ordinary helped her maintain the quality of stillness she needed for what came next. "Mr. Vance," she said, "my name is Charlotte Whitmore. A mutual connection suggested you might be open to a conversation." The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. "Who's the mutual connection?" Vance said. His voice was careful, not panicked, but the kind of careful that came from a man who had been waiting for a particular kind of phone call for a long time and was not certain whether this was it or its opposite. "Daniel Rice," Charlotte said. "He told me you had lunch 2 weeks ago and that you said something he thought I should hear." Another silence, shorter. "I can't talk on this line," Vance said. "I know. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to meet me tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. The coffee shop on West 44th, the one with the green awning. Come alone and don't tell anyone at the firm you're going." "Miss Whitmore wasn't Peter." She used his first name deliberately, the way you used a first name when you wanted someone to understand that the conversation had moved past formality into something that required a different kind of honesty. "I know what you have. I know what it costs you to hold on to it. And I know that the arrangement you're in has a ceiling that you've already hit." She paused. "Come tomorrow." She hung up before he could answer, which was a calculated risk. A man who was going to come would come whether she gave him the choice or not. A man who wasn't going to come would talk himself out of it if she left the line open. She set the phone on the counter and stood with her hands flat on the kitchen surface and breathed slowly for a moment. Then she called Dominic. "Vance answered," she said when he picked up. 7 tomorrow. "I'll have someone in the vicinity," Dominic said. "Not inside." "Outside, watching the approach." A pause. "This is standard, Charlotte. Not a question of trust." She accepted that. "Marcus?" "Quiet so far, which concerns me more than noise would." "He's watching. He's always watching. He learned it from me." Something in Dominic's voice on that last sentence that he didn't try to cover and didn't try to emphasize. Just a fact delivered flat, the way you delivered facts that had been sitting with you long enough to lose their sharp edges without losing their weight. "Get some sleep." "You too." She almost smiled when she said it. She didn't think he slept much either. She went to bed at 11 and lay awake until 2, and when she finally slept, it was without dreams, which was either a good sign or simply evidence that her body had given up on processing and moved directly into shutdown mode. She was at the coffee shop at 6:40. Vance arrived at 7:03. He was a man in his mid-40s, medium height, with the slightly compressed look of someone who had spent years making himself smaller in rooms where other people's personalities took up more space. He was wearing a gray coat and carrying nothing, no briefcase, no bag, which meant he had either come with information in his head or he had come to feel her out before committing to anything physical. He sat across from her, A server came and he ordered coffee without looking at the menu and without making eye contact with the server, which told her he was already past the point of managing ordinary social transactions. He was running on one track. "You said you know what I have," he said. He kept his voice low, which was appropriate given the ambient noise of the coffee shop, but there was something in the lowness that went beyond caution. He was a man talking quietly because the thing he was about to say felt like it had its own volume, and he was trying to contain it. Internal documentation of the Ashford capital structure from the original 1993 arrangement through the 2004 restructuring, Charlotte said. Specifically, the instruments that prove Dominic Blackwood's contribution was structured as equity participation, not a loan, and the 1997 legal maneuvering that reclassified it without his signature on the reclassification. Vance's coffee arrived. He wrapped both hands around the cup and didn't drink from it. "If that documentation becomes public," he said, "the Ashford family loses the legal basis for controlling approximately 60% of their current holdings." "I know." And several members of the firm, including the two senior partners who handled the 1997 restructuring, are exposed to disbarment proceedings at minimum. "I know that too." He looked at her. "Then you know why I couldn't go to anyone inside the firm." "Yes, and I know why you went to Daniel Rice instead of an attorney or a journalist." She held his gaze. "Because you needed someone who could take what you had and do something with it before the firm found out you'd taken it. Someone with the resources and the motivation to move fast and absorb the legal risk of how the documentation was obtained." Vance was quiet for a moment. "Are you that person?" he said. "I'm connected to that person," Charlotte said. "And I need to know one thing before we go further. The documents, are they complete? The full chain from 1993 to the 2004 filing?" "Yes. Including the meeting minutes from the 1997 board session where the reclassification was approved?" Something changed in Vance's face. A small tightening. "How do you know about the board minutes?" he said. "Because the reclassification couldn't have been legally processed without board approval, and if the approval happened without Blackwood's knowledge, those minutes are either falsified or they record a decision made in deliberate bad faith, either of which is actionable." She watched him. "Which is it?" Vance set down his coffee cup. "They're falsified," he said. "His signature on the approval document is not his signature. I had it compared by a private examiner 8 months ago." He said it the way you said something you had been holding for 8 months, with a kind of exhausted relief, the relief of a weight transferred, mixed with the specific fear of having transferred it to someone who might drop it. Charlotte felt the information settle into her chest like something solid. "All right," she said. "Here's what happens next. You give me physical copies of everything. The full chain, the board minutes, the examiner's report on the signature. I transfer them to the person I'm working with. Within 10 days, those documents are in the hands of an attorney who can initiate proceedings that fall entirely outside the Ashford firm's jurisdiction. Your name is not attached to anything in the initial filing. Whether it emerges later depends on how the proceedings develop, but I will do everything I can to protect your position." Vance looked at her for a long moment. "Everything you can," he repeated. "Yes. That's not a guarantee." "No," Charlotte said. "It's not. I won't lie to you about that." She held his gaze. "But right now you're holding material that could end careers and restructure a family empire, and you're doing it alone. And every day you hold it, the risk that someone in that firm notices something irregular grows. You called Daniel. That was a decision. This is the next one." The coffee shop noise moved around them. Espresso machines, low conversations, the door opening and closing as the morning built toward its peak. Vance picked up his cup and finally drank from it. "I'll have everything ready by tomorrow evening," he said. Charlotte nodded. "Text this number when you're ready." She slid a card across the table, a number she'd bought specifically for this, registered to nothing connected to her name. "One text? I'll arrange the transfer." He pocketed the card without looking at it and stood and left without finishing his coffee, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of his nerves and nothing she didn't already know about the difficulty of what he was about to do. She sat for another 10 minutes after he left, drinking her own coffee, watching the street through the window. Dominic's man. She had spotted him when she arrived, A lean figure with a paper in a doorway across the street who had not turned a page in 20 minutes was gone by the time Vance left, which meant he had followed Vance. Standard. She had agreed to it. She still didn't entirely love it, but she understood the logic, and she was not in a position to let preference override practicality. She paid, left, and walked back toward her apartment in the cold. She was 2 blocks away when her phone buzzed. The text was from a number she didn't recognize, and the message was 4 words. "We need to talk." She stopped walking. She looked at the number. She didn't know it. But the text had arrived on the secondary phone, the one only Dominic and now Vance had, which meant either Dominic had given the number to someone or the number had been obtained another way. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under 10 seconds. Marcus Blackwood. "I know about Vance. Meet me today or this gets very complicated very fast." Charlotte stood on the sidewalk in the cold with people moving around her, and she felt the specific physical sensation of a situation compressing, the walls of it coming in from multiple directions simultaneously, the way a problem that had seemed manageable suddenly revealed its actual dimensions. She had days, Dominic had said. She had apparently had less than 18 hours. She stood there for another moment, then typed, "Where?" She called Dominic from a payphone she found 2 blocks from her apartment, which she had identified as a contingency option 3 days ago, because she was the kind of person who identified contingency options and had stopped being embarrassed about it. "Marcus texted me," she said when he answered, "on the secondary number." The silence that followed was short and dense. "How?" Dominic said. "Either someone in your circle gave it to him, or he pulled it from your phone directly." "He doesn't have access to my—" Dominic stopped. "When he came into the room yesterday, I had the phone on the table. He could have seen it when he came in, the call log, or the contact." Charlotte kept her voice even. "He wants to meet. He says he knows about Vance. Does he know about the documentation? I don't know yet. I'm going to find out." "Charlotte, I have to go," she said. "He'll move if I don't." She paused. "Does Marcus have direct contact with Nathaniel Ashford?" The pause on Dominic's end told her everything. "He's been in contact with the Ashford legal team for 4 years, Dominic said, through a consulting arrangement that he told me was unrelated to the family business. I allowed it because I was trying to—" He stopped again. The sentence didn't finish because there was no clean ending to it. He had allowed it because he was a father, which was not a fact he was accustomed to being undone by, and which was undoing him now. "All right," Charlotte said. "I need you to not contact Marcus until I've met with him. Don't alert him. Don't try to intercept. If he senses you know about the text, he'll move immediately. And if he moves immediately anyway, then we accelerate. Call your attorney tonight. Have the filing ready to execute on 12 hours' notice instead of 48. A pause. "That's not enough preparation time for—" "I know," Charlotte said. "Do it anyway." She hung up and stood for a moment in the particular smell of a payphone in New York in October, which was not a smell anyone would choose, but which had the advantage of being completely grounded in the physical world. And the physical world right now was what she needed. She met Marcus Blackwood at 1 o'clock at a restaurant in Midtown that he had chosen, which meant it was a place where he felt he had some form of advantage, whether that was familiarity or association, or simply the psychological benefit of having picked the location. She filed all of this as she walked in and found him at a corner table with his back to the wall, which was a choice that told her the training had come from his father, even if the loyalties hadn't. He was already there when she arrived. He had coffee and had not ordered food, which meant he was not planning for this to be a long meeting. He watched her sit down with the expression of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was running it through one final check before deployment. "You went to my father with the Ashford documentation," Marcus said. No preamble. "Yes," Charlotte said, "and you're planning to use it to initiate legal proceedings that would force an audit of the original capital structure." "That's the direction, yes." "And you think my father is going to go along with this?" "He already has," Charlotte said. "We've been working on the structure for a week." Something moved in Marcus's face, not surprise, because he had known this, but the particular reaction of a man who had known something intellectually and was now having it confirmed in a way that made it real in a different register. You don't understand what you've started, Marcus said. Tell me. He looked at her steadily. My father has been building toward this for 12 years. I know that. I'm not pretending I don't know what the history is. He stopped, and for a moment the composed exterior showed a seam, something underneath it that was neither cold nor calculated, but was instead a kind of old and exhausted grief that surprised her by being visible at all. But you don't know what the Ashford family is capable of when they feel threatened. You've been dealing with Nathaniel. Nathaniel is the face. He's not the mechanism. Charlotte held very still. Then tell me about the mechanism, she said. Richard Ashford, Marcus said. Nathaniel's uncle. He's been the actual operational mind of that family for 20 years. Nathaniel signs things and attends events. Richard decides what happens. He set down his coffee cup. Richard was the one who orchestrated the 1997 restructuring. Richard is the one who has maintained the arrangement with our firm, my father's firm, that's kept the legal exposure buried. And Richard, Marcus said, has known about your investigation for 6 days. The cold that moved through Charlotte's chest was not metaphorical. How? She said. Because Peter Vance, Marcus said, is not just a disaffected employee who wants out of a bad arrangement. He has been Richard Ashford's inside source in my father's legal network for 3 years. Every piece of information that has passed through Vance has gone to Richard first. He looked at her, and his expression was not cruel, but it was not gentle either. It was the expression of a man delivering damage he felt was necessary. The meeting this morning, the documents Vance promised you, Richard knows about all of it. Charlotte heard the words and her mind processed them with a terrible clarity, running backward through the sequence, the phone call, the coffee shop, Vance's careful fear that had read as authentic because it was authentic, the 4 days between her first meeting with Dominic and his call back, plenty of time for Vance to have reported, for Richard to have assessed, for a counter-strategy to have been constructed around the specific shape of what she was trying to do. The documents Vance is going to hand over, she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. Will be what Richard wants you to have, Marcus said. Not the real chain, a version of it. One that's been modified to create exposure in specific places. Places that, when the filing happens, will discredit the entire claim and potentially expose my father to a fraud countersuit that will tie him up in litigation for years. Charlotte sat with that. The restaurant noise continued around them. A table of businessmen laughed at something. The sound was completely disconnected from what was happening 4 feet away from them. Why are you telling me this? Charlotte said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Because my father is 70 years old, he said. And he has spent 12 years alone, and he is about to walk into a trap built specifically to use the thing he wants most, justice, as the mechanism of his destruction. His voice was still controlled, but the seam was wider now, the thing underneath visible in a way she suspected he had not planned for. And because whatever I've done, whatever arrangements I made when I was 28 and stupid and thought I knew how the world worked, I am not able to watch that happen. Charlotte looked at him across the table. You've been feeding information to the Ashford team, she said. Yes. For 4 years. Yes. And now you want to stop. I've wanted to stop for 2 of those 4 years, Marcus said. Wanting and doing are different problems when you're in the middle of something with people who don't allow exits. Charlotte understood this. She understood it in a way she had not expected to understand it 3 hours ago, and the understanding was complicated, and she didn't have time to be complicated about it. What do you want from me? She said. Tell my father, Marcus said, before Vance delivers those documents. Tell him what they are and where they came from. Give him the chance to adjust. He stopped. And if there's any way, any legal way, to give me a path that isn't full exposure when this goes public, I am telling you everything I know about Richard Ashford's operational structure. Everything. 12 years of it. Charlotte sat in the corner of that restaurant and looked at Dominic Blackwood's son across a table in a restaurant where businessmen were laughing about something irrelevant, and she understood with complete and cold clarity that everything she had built in the last 3 months had just been revealed as a structure erected on sand, and that the person sitting across from her might be the only material available from which to build something that could actually hold weight, and that trusting him was an enormous risk, and that not trusting him was worse. She had come here to survive a betrayal. She had not expected to have to decide in real time whether to trust the person who had just revealed it to her. She looked at Marcus Blackwood, and she made the decision the way she made all the decisions that mattered, which was by accepting that there was no safe version of the choice and moving toward the one that gave her the most room to operate if she was wrong. "Call your father," she said. "Right now. Tell him you need to see him today. Don't tell him why on the phone." She stood and picked up her coat. "I'll be there in an hour." Marcus looked up at her. "You believe me," he said. It came out with a texture of genuine uncertainty, like a man who had not expected to be believed and was not entirely sure what believing looked like. "I believe that Richard Ashford, having 6 days of advance intelligence about our movements, is consistent with everything else I know about how that family operates," Charlotte said. "And I believe that if you were running a counter-operation right now, you wouldn't have told me about the board minutes being falsified, because that's the one piece of the real documentation that Richard would want me not to know he knows we have." She held his gaze. "So yes, I believe you." She walked out of the restaurant into the cold afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for 3 seconds, 3 full counted seconds, allowing herself to feel the full weight of how badly the ground had shifted beneath everything she had constructed. Then she started walking. Because the documents Vance was going to hand over tomorrow evening were poisoned, and Richard Ashford had known about the plan for 6 days, and somewhere in a building she had never been inside, a man she had never met was waiting for her to walk into the specific trap he had built for her using the shape of everything she wanted most, and she had less than 24 hours to find the real documents before Vance handed her the false ones, and the window closed forever. She walked fast, head down, the cold coming off the pavement in waves that pressed through the wool of her coat like it wasn't there. 24 hours. The number sat in her chest like a stone with a specific weight, and she carried it and kept moving. Her phone was already in her hand, and she was dialing Dominic before she reached the corner, and when he picked up on the second ring, she didn't give him a greeting because there was no time for greetings, and he would understand that. "Vance is Richard's man," she said. "He's been feeding intelligence to the Ashford team for 3 years. The documents he's going to hand over tomorrow are modified to expose us. Richard has known about the plan for 6 days." The silence on Dominic's end lasted 2 seconds. "Where are you getting this?" he said. "Marcus?" Another silence. Longer. "Charlotte." "I know," she said. "I thought about it. It holds. The detail about the board minutes, but he told me Richard knows we have them, which means if Marcus were running a counter move, he would have let us keep thinking those minutes were our private advantage. He gave that up. That's not a move you make if you're playing for the other side." She heard Dominic breathing on the other end of the line. Slow, deliberate, the breathing of a man exercising control over something that wanted to move faster than control allowed. "My son," he said. And then nothing else, because there was nothing else to say about it in this moment that wouldn't cost time they didn't have. "Marcus is coming to you in an hour," Charlotte said. "He has 12 years of Richard Ashford's operational detail, full structure, the instruments, the intermediaries, the legal arrangements. If even half of it is usable, it changes everything we have." Oh, she turned a corner and kept walking. "But we need the real documents, the authentic chain, not the version Richard is going to hand us through Vance. Do you have anything in what you kept from the original arrangement? Any physical record from 1993 or 1997 that wasn't routed through the firm?" "There's a storage facility in Queens," Dominic said slowly. "I haven't accessed it in 11 years. I don't know what condition. I need to know what's in it. I'd have to go myself. I don't send anyone else there." "Then go. Today. Right now." She stopped at a crossing and waited for the light, her breath visible in the cold air in short, controlled bursts. "If there's anything in that facility that documents the original equity arrangement in your own hand, correspondence, term sheets, anything predating the firm's involvement, we don't need Vance's documents. We can build the case on authentics that Richard Ashford has never had access to because he didn't know they existed." The light changed. She crossed. "If he's had 6 days," Dominic said, "he may have already filed preemptive motions, protective instruments on the Ashford holdings." Has your attorney flagged anything? I'll call him now. Do that first, then Queens. She reached the subway entrance and stopped at the top of the stairs, the underground air rising around her feet. And Dominic, Marcus said Richard doesn't allow exits from his arrangements. Think about what that means for how we handle Marcus going forward. I understand what it means. He may need physical protection before this is over. A pause. I'll handle my son, Dominic said, and the sentence carried everything it needed to carry without adding anything to it. She went down into the subway. She spent the 40 minutes on the train doing two things simultaneously, which was not comfortable but was necessary. The first was thinking through the counterstructure, what they had, what they needed, what the sequence had to be if the Queen's facility produced anything usable. The second was sitting with the full shape of what Richard Ashford had done. He had not simply maintained a source inside Dominic's legal network. He had constructed a scenario. He had waited for someone, her, or someone like her, to approach Dominic with the Ashford history and a plan for action, and he had positioned Vance to manage the information flow and shape the resulting move into something he could collapse at the moment of maximum impact. He had been patient about it the way a man was patient when he had been managing this particular exposure for 30 years, and understood that the greatest risk was not a frontal attack, but a careful, documented legal claim built by someone with the right material and the right motivation. He had seen her coming, or he had seen the type of person she was, and prepared for whoever eventually showed up. She got off the train and walked 8 blocks to her apartment and went directly to her desk. The original 12 pages she had written that first night were still in the portfolio. She opened it and went to the section she had built on the 1993 arrangement, and she read through it with a different set of eyes, looking now not for what it revealed but for what it didn't, for the gaps, for the places where she had accepted a chain of inference because the evidence was suggestive rather than definitive. There were 3. She wrote them on a separate page and numbered them. Then she picked up her phone and called a woman named Soren. Adrienne Soren was a forensic document examiner who worked primarily for insurance companies and occasionally, on a referral-only basis, for private clients whose needs fell outside the insurance context. Charlotte had used her once before for a contract dispute involving her consulting work and had found her to be precise, fast, and completely uninterested in the nature of the work beyond its technical dimensions. I may need you in the next 48 hours, Charlotte said when Soren picked up. Original documents, potentially 11 to 30 years old, ink analysis, signature verification, dating. Can you clear time? What volume? Soren said. Unknown. Could be a single page, could be 30. I won't know until I know. I can clear tomorrow afternoon after 2. It may need to be tomorrow morning. A pause. 8 o'clock, not earlier. 8 works. I'll confirm tonight whether it's happening. She hung up and looked at the 3 gaps on her page. Her phone buzzed. Dominic. The attorney confirms no preemptive filings yet, he said. Richard may be waiting for us to execute the original plan before moving. Maximum damage at maximum moment. That means we still have the window, Charlotte said. Did you go to Queens? I'm there now. She heard a door. Metal. Heavy. The sound of a facility lock disengaging. Give me 20 minutes. I'll wait. She waited. 17 minutes later, he called back, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not softened, but changed, the way a material changed when it was subjected to specific pressure and came out altered rather than broken. There's a lockbox, he said. From 1992. I haven't opened it in 20 years. A pause. The original term sheet from the 1993 arrangement, signed by both parties. My signature and Gerald Ashford's, Nathaniel's father. Handwritten annotations in the margins. The term sheet specifies equity participation, 31%, with a clause preventing reclassification without mutual written consent. Another pause. And correspondence. 8 letters between me and Gerald between 1993 and 1996. The last one is dated 4 months before the restructuring. He's asking me to agree to the reclassification voluntarily. My response is in there. I refused. Charlotte closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. That's the case, she said. That's the entire case. The falsified board minutes, the modified documents Vance was going to hand us, none of it matters. This predates all of it, and it's in Gerald Ashford's own hand. Yes. Bring everything to Soren's office tomorrow at 8. I'll send you the address. She was already writing it down. Don't tell Marcus the facility location, not yet. Agreed. And Dominic. She stopped. Don't carry that lockbox in your own car. Use someone you trust completely and have it transported separately. A pause. You think Richard is watching my movements? I think a man who had 6 days of advance intelligence and still chose to play it slowly has contingencies we haven't mapped yet, Charlotte said. Don't give him a simple interception point. All right. A pause. Marcus is with me now. She hadn't expected that. He went to Queens with you? He was at the building when I arrived. He knew about the facility. The sentence landed with a weight that she recognized as Dominic absorbing something about his son that he had not known before, or had known and had not wanted to confirm. He said he wanted to be here, that he'd known about it for years and had never told Richard. Charlotte sat with that. Is that true? She said. I think it is, Dominic said. I think it's the one thing he managed to keep. She let that go because there was no time to do anything else with it. Bring him with you tomorrow, she said. His operational knowledge of Richard's structure is the other half of what we need. She did not sleep that night. At 2 a.m, her phone buzzed with a text from the secondary number. Vance, documents ready. Can we move the transfer to tonight? She stared at the message for a long time. Richard was accelerating. Something had shifted in his timeline. Either Marcus's absence from contact had alarmed him, or some other variable had moved, and he was now trying to compress the handoff before the window changed. She typed back, Tomorrow as planned. I'll confirm location in the morning. She set the phone down. At 3:45 it buzzed again. This time the message was from a number she had never seen, and it contained no text, only a photograph. The photograph was of Charlotte, taken from street level, walking out of the restaurant where she had met Marcus. The timestamp on the image was from that afternoon. She was on the sidewalk mid-stride, coat open, phone in hand. Beneath the photograph was a single line. Careful who you have lunch with, Ms. Whitmore. Some conversations are more expensive than others. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she took a screenshot, forwarded it to Dominic with the caption, Richard knows about Marcus and me. Tonight changes everything. And she put the phone face down on the desk and sat in the dark of her apartment and let herself feel, for exactly the duration of 1 full minute, the specific fear of being visible to a man who had spent 30 years making other people disappear from inconvenient situations. 1 minute. Then she turned the phone back over and started making calls. By 6 a.m, she had done 4 things. She had arranged for Soren to receive the lockbox materials directly at her laboratory rather than waiting for the 8 o'clock meeting with a trusted courier Dominic had provided and whom she had verified independently. She had contacted an attorney named Bridget Cho, a woman who had built her practice on exactly this category of long-suppressed corporate fraud claim and whose name had appeared in 2 cases that bore structural similarity to what they were building, and had given her a 40-minute briefing that Cho had listened to without interruption before saying, quietly, Send me what you have by noon, and I'll tell you if we can file by end of week. She had written out everything Marcus had told her about Richard Ashford's operational structure in the specific format Cho had requested, organized by instrument and timeline. And she had sent one message to Peter Vance, Transfer canceled, don't contact me again. She expected a response. She got silence, which told her Vance had reported to Richard immediately, because a man acting in genuine good faith would have asked why. At 7:45, she was in Soren's office, a clean, spare room in a building on the east side that smelled like solvent and old paper, when Dominic arrived with Marcus and a courier who set a locked case on the examination table and left without speaking. Soren opened the case and began working without preamble. Charlotte watched her, and then she looked at Dominic, who was standing at the window the way he had been standing at the window the first time she'd walked into his room in the Meridian building, looking out at the street, his back to the room, his hands at his sides. But the posture was different now. Something in the set of his shoulders had changed. He had driven to a storage facility in Queens and opened a lockbox he hadn't touched in 20 years. and whatever that had cost him was visible in the way he was standing, even if it wasn't visible anywhere else. Marcus was seated, his coat still on, his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor. He had the look of a man who had been awake all night, arriving somewhere he had spent years refusing to go, and was only now beginning to understand that the refusal had been its own kind of slow damage. No one said anything for 11 minutes while Soren worked. "The term sheet is authentic," Soren said without looking up. "Paper and ink composition consistent with early to mid-90s production. The annotations in the margins are in a different ink from the base document, added later, consistent with the ink dating to mid-90s as well. No signs of alteration or insertion." She moved to the letters. "I'll need another 20 minutes for the correspondence." "Take what you need," Charlotte said. She looked at Marcus. "Richard is going to know by mid-morning that Vance's handoff didn't happen," she said. "What does he do?" Marcus raised his eyes from the floor. They were red-edged, not from crying, but from the specific exhaustion of a night spent in the company of something you couldn't put down. "He contacts Nathaniel," Marcus said. "Nathaniel goes to his legal team. They file an injunction against any claim involving the original capital structure, citing—" He stopped. "There's a provision Richard put in place 3 years ago, a preemptive legal instrument tied to the Ashford Family Trust that creates a 90-day hold on any challenge to the foundational capital arrangement. He's been sitting on it. It requires a triggering filing to activate." Charlotte stared at him. "He built a 90-day lockout into the trust." "Yes." "How long ago?" 3 years ago, after Daniel Rice started asking questions about the original structure in a professional context. Richard saw it as early warning of the approach and built the instrument in response. Marcus's jaw tightened. "If he files the activation before Cho files the claim, you lose the window. Every piece of authentic documentation Soren is looking at right now becomes inaccessible in court for 90 days, and in 90 days Richard will have moved everything he needs to move." The room was very quiet. Dominic had turned from the window. He was looking at his son with an expression that was not readable as a single thing, but contained somewhere inside it the specific quality of a man seeing, clearly and without protection, the consequences of a decade of choices, his own and someone else's, arriving simultaneously. "What's the activation filing process?" Charlotte said. Her voice was completely level. She had a physical awareness of her own pulse, elevated, and she managed it the way she managed most things that she could not eliminate, by acknowledging it and continuing. "It goes through the court clerk's office," Marcus said. "Richard's attorney has to file in person. It can't be done remotely because the instrument requires a notarized original." He paused. "The attorney's name is Franklin Greer. He works out of an office in Lower Manhattan. He's been Richard's legal fixer for 20 years. "So if Greer walks into that clerk's office before Cho files our claim," Charlotte said, "we lose 90 days. "Yes." "And Richard knows we canceled the Vance handoff as of—" She checked the time. "Approximately 90 minutes ago." "He knew within minutes of your text," Marcus said. "He monitors Vance's communications." Charlotte looked at Dominic. Dominic looked back at her. "Call Cho," he said. It was the first thing he had said since they arrived in this room, and his voice was quiet and completely without equivocation. Charlotte was already calling. Cho picked up on the second ring. "I need to know if you can file this morning," Charlotte said. "Not end of week. This morning, within 2 hours." A pause on Cho's end that lasted long enough for Charlotte to feel her pulse in her temples. "I reviewed the preliminary materials you sent at midnight," Cho said. "If the Soren authentication confirms what you're describing, and if the Marcus Blackwood testimony on the operational structure is available in sworn affidavit form, I can file an emergency motion with the authenticated documents as foundation and supplement with the full brief by end of day." Another pause. "But Charlotte, I need the authentication results in my hand, in writing, by 9:15, and the Blackwood affidavit by 9:30. Those are hard stops." Charlotte looked at Soren's back as she bent over the documents on the examination table. She looked at Marcus. "Can you give a sworn affidavit on the Ashford operational structure right now?" she said. "In this room, in the next 40 minutes. Marcus Blackwood looked at her, and in his face she saw the particular expression of a man arriving at a line he had been approaching for 4 years and had spent 4 years refusing to cross, and she saw him cross it. Not dramatically, not with any visible relief, but with the quiet, deliberate finality of someone who had run out of reasons not to. "Yes," he said. Soren spoke without turning around. "Authentication confirmed on all materials," she said. "I can have the written report in 20 minutes. Charlotte turned back to the phone. 9:15, she said to Cho. "You'll have everything." She hung up and looked at Dominic, who was still standing in the center of the room, and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was something older and more complicated than triumph. The face of a man who had been waiting 12 years for a morning that was now, finally, here, and who was discovering that arrival felt less like victory and more like the moment the anesthetic wore off, and everything that had been numb began to be felt again. "We need a notary," Charlotte said to no one in particular, already moving. Marcus stood up and reached into his coat pocket and produced a notary stamp and seal that he set on the examination table without explanation. Charlotte stared at it. "I've been licensed for 6 years, Marcus said flatly. "Richard required it for document work. I kept the license current." He held her gaze. "I can't notarize my own affidavit, but I can notarize Dominic's supporting statement if you need it." For one moment, one fractured, exhausted moment, Charlotte almost said something that was not tactical. Something about the specific absurdity and the specific sadness of a man who had spent years serving someone else's agenda and had, the whole time, been carrying a tool in his coat pocket that would help undo it. She didn't say it. "Start writing," she said to Marcus. "Your affidavit. Everything you told me about Richard's operational structure, in chronological order, as specific as you can make it." She moved to the table beside Soren. "I'll coordinate with Cho on format while you write." The next 50 minutes were the most precisely calibrated 50 minutes Charlotte Whitmore had ever spent. She was on the phone with Cho 3 times. She read back sections of Marcus's handwritten affidavit as he produced them, and Cho directed revisions in real time. Soren produced the authentication report, and Charlotte photographed it and transmitted it at 9:08. Marcus finished the affidavit at 9:19, and Dominic notarized the 2 documents that required it with the specific, careful attention of a man who understood that what he was signing carried the weight of everything the last 12 years had been moving toward. Cho filed at 9:41. Charlotte was standing at the window, the same window Dominic had been standing at when she first came in, when her phone buzzed with Cho's confirmation text. She read it. She stood with the phone in her hand and the cold light of a late October morning coming through the glass and the sounds of the room behind her. Soren packing her materials, the rustle of Marcus gathering the remaining documents, Dominic's quiet presence somewhere behind her right shoulder. "It's filed," she said. The room was quiet. Then her phone rang. The number was one she recognized. Nathaniel Ashford's personal cell, a number she had not heard from in 6 months. A number she had considered deleting and had not deleted for reasons she no longer needed to justify. She looked at the name on the screen. She felt Dominic step up beside her, not touching, just present. The specific quality of presence that a person who had survived a long time by reading rooms brought to a moment of decision. She answered. "Nathaniel," she said. His voice on the other end was not the composed, reasonable voice she had heard in her apartment 6 months ago when he had stood in her living room and told her she was too difficult to love. It was stripped of its management. It was a voice that had just been told something and had not yet found its way back to performance. "What did you do?" he said. "What needed to be done?" Charlotte said. "Richard is—" He stopped. She heard him breathing. "You don't understand what you've started. You don't know what he'll do." "I have a reasonable idea," Charlotte said. "And I filed anyway." A silence that lasted long enough for her to hear him trying to reassemble himself on the other end, and failing. "Charlotte," his voice had dropped. The reasonable tone was trying to come back, but the foundation under it was gone, and they both knew it. "This doesn't have to go this far. We can what, Nathaniel?" she said. And her voice was not angry, which was the thing that she knew would reach him in a way that anger never could. Anger was manageable. This was not. We can negotiate, compromise, find an arrangement that works for everyone. She paused. You told me I was too difficult to understand. You told me I was too ambitious. You told me Victoria understood you in ways I never could. She looked out the window at the street below. You were right. I didn't understand you. I didn't understand that a man who could look at what we had and choose what you chose was a man I had never actually known at all. She heard him exhale. The filing will hold, she said. Richard is going to find out that the instrument he spent 3 years building was activated 40 minutes too late. Tell him that from me. She ended the call. Her hand was not shaking. She turned from the window and found Dominic watching her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. Not the assessment of the first meeting, not the calculation of the working sessions, but something unguarded, something that had come forward from behind the decades of careful management, looking at her the way you looked at someone who had just done something you had not been certain they could do, and that you found, now that it was done, both expected and remarkable. It won't end here, he said quietly. Richard will move. He has resources and he has time, and he will not accept this. I know, Charlotte said. What he does next will be worse than what he's done so far. I know that too. Dominic looked at her steadily in the cold morning light, and the thing that had been building between them across weeks of working in the same direction. Not romance, not yet, something harder and more foundational than that. The specific gravity of two people who had each been, in their different ways, alone with a problem for a very long time, and who had learned through the work of these past weeks that the other person would not flinch at the moments that mattered, was present in the room as clearly as the documents on the table and the cold light through the glass. Then we need to be ready for what comes next, Charlotte said. Dominic nodded once. And in a building in Lower Manhattan, in the office of a man named Franklin Greer, a phone was ringing with a call from Richard Ashford, and the conversation that was about to happen in that office would set in motion the final and most dangerous phase of everything that Charlotte Whitmore had started on a Thursday morning when she walked through a lobby door and sat across from a man the city was afraid of and told him she wanted justice. Richard Ashford had spent 30 years making problems disappear. He had never had a problem that looked like Charlotte Blackwood. Richard Ashford moved fast. By noon on the day of the filing, Bridget Cho had received 2 calls from opposing counsel, one professional, one that was not, and a formal letter of intent to challenge the authentication of the lockbox materials on the grounds that chain of custody had not been established. By 2 in the afternoon, a story appeared on a financial news aggregator suggesting that a former associate of the Blackwood organization was making unsubstantiated claims against the Ashford Family Trust in what unnamed sources described as a coordinated harassment campaign motivated by a personal dispute. Charlotte read the story at her desk. She read it twice. Then she called Cho. The chain of custody challenge, she said. Anticipated, Cho said. Soren's authentication report includes provenance documentation for the lockbox itself. The facility lease dated 1992, Dominic Blackwood's name on the original rental agreement. The materials never left his possession because they were never in anyone else's possession. The challenge won't hold. A pause. The press story is more concerning because it personalizes it, because it establishes a narrative before the court proceedings create one. If the first thing the relevant judges read is that this is a scorned woman and an aging criminal making trouble for a respected family, the procedural landscape gets harder. Cho's voice was even, but Charlotte heard the weight in it. We need to get ahead of this. How? Let me talk to you about a journalist named Carla Reyes, Cho said. She's been investigating the Boston situation, the family before yours, for about 8 months. She has sources I don't have access to, and she's been sitting on the story because she didn't have the New York connection. You give her the New York connection, she publishes before Richard's narrative has time to solidify. Charlotte thought about this for exactly as long as it required. Set up the call, she said. Carla Reyes was on the phone with Charlotte at 4 that afternoon, and she asked questions the way good journalists ask questions. Not leading, not performing, just building a structure from the answers. One specific question following another with the patient assembly of someone who already had a framework and was checking its load-bearing points. 40 minutes in, Reyes said, "The Chicago case, the man who lost his company." "I know about him," Charlotte said. "I don't have documentation on Chicago. What I have is New York, and I have a source who can connect the methodology across cases." Marcus Blackwood. "He's available to speak on background for now. On record after the filing is substantiated." A pause. "If I publish before the court substantiates," Reyes said, "I'm exposed." "I know. I'm not asking you to publish on my account. I'm asking you to be ready. Richard Ashford spent the last 6 hours building a story about me. I want to make sure there's a different story ready to go the moment the proceeding validates the claim." Another pause, longer. "I'll be ready," Reyes said. Charlotte hung up and sat back in her chair and allowed herself 30 seconds of nothing. No planning, no sequencing, just the physical sensation of having been on her feet, mentally, for 36 hours straight, and the specific heaviness in her chest and behind her eyes that came with it. 30 seconds. Then she stood up and went back to work. Richard Ashford did not come at her through the courts. He came through Victoria. 3 days after the filing, Charlotte's phone rang at 7 in the morning with a number she recognized because she had looked at it on caller ID 18 months ago and chosen not to answer then, and was choosing differently now. "Charlotte," Victoria said. Her voice was the same as it had always been, measured, warm at the surface, with a precision underneath it that Charlotte had once mistaken for competence and now recognized as calculation. She heard it differently now. She heard the mechanism. "Victoria," Charlotte said, "I think it's time we spoke honestly with each other." "I've been waiting for that for about 2 years," Charlotte said. "Go ahead." A brief pause. So brief most people would have missed it. Victoria absorbing the directness, recalibrating. "What you're doing with the Blackwood man," Victoria said, "it's going to hurt people who don't deserve it. Nathaniel isn't Richard. Whatever Richard has done, and I'm not defending Richard, Nathaniel is not responsible for the decisions made before he was old enough to have a say in them." "That's an interesting argument," Charlotte said. "Did Nathaniel ask you to make it?" "I'm making it on my own." "Then let me be honest with you on my own as well." Charlotte moved to the window, the same window she had stood at dozens of times in the last months, watching the street. "You spent 4 years in my family's home building a position. You learned how my father thought, what he was afraid of, what he wanted. You used his illness. You used his grief after my mother died. And you arranged his finances in the last year of his life in ways that were legal and completely deliberate." She paused. "I'm not talking about Nathaniel right now. I'm talking about you." The silence that followed was different from Victoria's usual silences, which were controlled, deployed. This one had an edge to it. "I cared about your father," Victoria said, and the remarkable thing was that it was partially true, which was what made Victoria Caldwell genuinely dangerous. The lies she told were always wrapped around something real, something she had taken and used and almost believed. "You did," Charlotte said. "And you also systematically reduced his estate's liquid assets in ways that benefited you specifically. Both things are true. The caring doesn't cancel the other thing." "Charlotte." "The Boston family," Charlotte said, "and Chicago. I know about both of them. So does Carla Reyes." She let that land. "Victoria, I'm not calling the filing off. That ship has sailed. What I'm telling you right now, honestly, is that the piece of this that is specifically about you does not have to go public in the way that Richard's piece does. The estate arrangements, the methodology across 3 families, that's Reyes's story, and it can be told with your name in it or with your name peripheral. That depends entirely on what you do in the next week." A long silence. "What do you want?" Victoria said, and the warmth was gone now, entirely. Just the mechanism underneath, direct and unadorned. "A full accounting of the estate arrangements. A legal agreement returning the liquid assets that were repositioned in the last 14 months of my father's life. Signed, notarized, filed with Cho's office." Charlotte's voice was even. "Not because it gets you off the hook legally. That's Cho's determination, not mine. But because it's the only version of this where you have any agency left. Richard is going to be the story. You can either be a footnote to it, or you can be a parallel headline. That choice is still yours. She heard Victoria breathing on the other end of the line. I'll have my attorney call Cho, Victoria said finally. Today, Charlotte said. Not this week. A pause. Today, Victoria said. The call ended. Charlotte stood at the window for a moment. The street below was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, containing everything. She felt something she couldn't immediately name, and she stood with it until she could. It was not satisfaction. It was the specific and unglamorous sensation of a task completed that had cost more than the completed version looked like from the outside. She went to make coffee and found herself standing at the kitchen counter with the mug in her hand, not drinking, thinking about her father. About Sunday mornings, about reading glasses low on a nose and the financial section held up at an angle to catch the light. She missed him with a sudden and physical specificity that was not grief so much as the acknowledgement of an absence that would never stop being an absence. She drank her coffee. Victoria's attorney called Cho's office at 2:15 that afternoon. Reyes published her piece 4 days later, the morning after the court issued its initial ruling validating the authentication of Dominic's lockbox materials and authorizing the full proceeding. The piece ran with the headline, Charlotte never saw because she didn't look at headlines. She read the body of it, sitting at her desk, and she read it the way she read everything, carefully, looking for what it said and what it chose not to say. Reyes had written it well. She had connected the three families, Boston, Chicago, New York, with the specific patience of a journalist who had spent 8 months building toward a moment and had not rushed the arrival. Victoria's name was in it. Richard Ashford's name was in it. The Ashford capital structure, the falsified board minutes, the 30-year concealment, all of it was in it, sourced and documented and laid out with the clarity of something that had always been true and was only now becoming visible. Charlotte read to the end. Her name was in the last paragraph, in a sentence that described her as the person whose documentation had provided the New York connection. Not a victim, not a hero, just the person who had found the thread and pulled it. She closed the article. She called Dominic. Reyes is out, she said. I saw it. A pause. Richard's attorney filed a motion this morning to have my lockbox materials excluded on fourth-party provenance grounds. Cho says it'll be denied within 48 hours. It will, Charlotte said. The lease documentation is clean. Yes. A pause that was different from his usual pauses, longer, with a quality of something waiting inside it. Charlotte, I want to ask you something. She waited. When this is settled, Dominic said, when the proceedings are complete and the filing has done what it's going to do, what do you want? Not strategically, not legally. His voice was quiet and entirely without performance. What do you actually want? She sat with the question. It was the first time anyone had asked her that in a very long time, and she noticed the specific sensation of being asked it. The way it opened something that had been managed closed for months. The way the answer came not from her planning mind, but from somewhere older and less organized. I want to not have to fight like this for a while, she said. I want to sit somewhere quiet and not be sequencing 3 moves ahead. She stopped. I want the medical foundation work to be real, not a cover story, not a negotiating point. Real. It already is real, Dominic said. I know. I want to be part of making it more real. A pause. That can be arranged, he said, and the simplicity of it. No performance, no grand gesture, just a direct response to a direct statement, was the thing that moved her in a way that 3 months of high-stakes work had not quite managed. Dominic, she said. Yes. Thank you for not being who I was afraid you might be. A silence that lasted long enough to carry what it needed to carry without requiring more than that. Get some sleep, he said. You too. She almost smiled when she said it, the same way she had almost smiled the first time 3 months ago, and this time the smile completed itself. The full proceeding took 11 weeks. Charlotte did not attend every session. She attended the ones that required her testimony. 2 of them, each conducted in the careful procedural language of a legal system that moved at its own pace regardless of the urgency of the material it was processing. And she spent the rest of the 11 weeks doing her consulting work, meeting twice a week with the Blackwood Foundation's program director to develop the pediatric expansion that she had first used as a cover story, and that had, in the process of being used, become something she actually cared about. She found, in those weeks, that the work had a specific quality she had not encountered in the strategic work of the last months. It required a different kind of attention, less sequencing, more listening. The program director was a woman named June, 50-ish, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 20 years fighting for funding for things that mattered and had learned to celebrate incremental progress without performing enthusiasm about it. Charlotte liked her immediately and trusted her more slowly, which was how she trusted most people now. And June, who had been around long enough to recognize the difference between someone who said they cared about the work and someone who actually showed up for it, eventually stopped watching Charlotte with the carefully managed skepticism she brought to all new partnerships and started simply working alongside her. Richard Ashford's attorneys filed 11 motions over the course of the proceeding. 7 were denied. 3 were granted in forms that required adjustments to the timeline but did not affect the substance of the claim. 1 remained under consideration at the close of the 11 weeks and was ultimately resolved in a separate arbitration that took another 3 weeks beyond the main proceeding. At the end of it, the court issued a ruling that found the original 1993 capital arrangement to constitute equity participation as specified in the authenticated term sheet, that the 1997 reclassification had been conducted without the required mutual written consent as stipulated in the arrangement's own language, and that the falsification of the board minutes constituted actionable fraud that voided the reclassification in its entirety. The Ashford family's controlling interest in approximately 60% of their current holdings was found to have been built on a foundation to which Dominic Blackwood was entitled to 31% equity recovery. It was not everything. It was not supposed to be everything. The law did not work in totalities, and Charlotte had understood this from the beginning, had structured her expectations around what was achievable rather than what was satisfying, because satisfaction and achievability were different currencies, and confusing them was how people destroyed their own work in the final miles. What the ruling meant in practice was this: the Ashford empire did not collapse, it fractured. The restructuring required to comply with the equity recovery was significant enough that several of the family's secondary holdings had to be liquidated, and the process of liquidation in a compressed timeline meant the values obtained were unfavorable, and the unfavorable values compounded across a portfolio of the Ashford family's size meant the kind of damage that a family with their history of leverage could not easily absorb. Nathaniel understood this before the ruling was formally issued. Charlotte knew this because he called her a second time, 2 weeks before the end, and the call was different from the first one. The first call had been panic in a voice still wearing the clothing of composure. This call was a man with the composure gone, not replaced by panic, but by something quieter, and she thought, more honest. "I want you to know something," Nathaniel said. She waited. "I knew what Victoria was doing, not at first, but by the time I knew, Charlotte, before I came to see you. I knew she had maneuvered things with your father's estate, and I told myself it wasn't my business to involve myself in something between her and your family." He stopped. "That was a choice. I made it." Another stop. "I made a lot of choices, and I called them things other than choices." Charlotte sat at her desk and listened to this and felt the specific weight of it. Not the satisfaction she might have expected, not anger, but something quieter and sadder. The recognition of a person who had spent years arranging a story about himself that made his decisions livable, and who had arrived, through the mechanism of their consequences, at the place where the story no longer held. "I hear you," she said. "That's not an absolution." "No," she said, "it's not, but it's the truth. And I spent a long time not getting that from you." She paused. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Nathaniel said. "Figure out what's left." A pause. Are you all right?" The question surprised her by its smallness. After everything, the months of legal work, the filings, the risk, the accumulated cost of what she had set in motion, he was asking her if she was all right, and the question was genuine, stripped of agenda. "Yes," she said, "I am." She meant it. Kyum. Victoria's legal agreement with Cho's office was formalized in the 9th week of the main proceeding. The estate assets that had been repositioned were not fully recoverable. Some had been converted and moved through instruments that made direct return impractical, but what was recoverable was recovered, and the amount, while not what her father's estate would have held intact, was enough to constitute something real and to allow Charlotte to close that chapter of the accounting without the feeling that she had accepted an injustice in order to make peace with an inconvenience. She did not speak to Victoria again after the morning call. She did not think about it as unfinished. She thought about it as a door that had been opened, walked through, and properly closed, which was a different thing from a door that had simply never been reopened and was sitting warped in its frame, stuck. Marcus Blackwood's cooperation with the proceeding was entered into the record under a limited immunity arrangement that Cho negotiated over the course of 3 weeks with the relevant oversight authorities. The arrangement was not clean. No arrangement of that kind ever was, and Marcus emerged from it with a formal acknowledgement of his role in the information sharing with the Ashford team and a set of conditions attached to his professional practice going forward that would follow him for years. He accepted the conditions. Charlotte saw him once during the proceeding, in the corridor outside the courtroom on the day of her second testimony. He was waiting. She didn't know what for, perhaps simply to be in proximity to something he had helped build. And he looked the way he had looked in Soren's office on the morning of the filing. Still carrying weight, but carrying it differently. Not the compressed weight of a man trying to be smaller than the thing he was holding. The different weight of someone who had put something down and was only now learning to walk without it. "How are you?" she said, because it was what you said, and also because she meant it. "Working on it," Marcus said. She nodded and went into the courtroom. Out. The day after the ruling, Dominic called her at 8 in the morning and asked if she wanted to see the new facility. She knew which facility he meant, the pediatric center, the one the foundation had been funding for 2 years, whose construction had been completed 6 weeks ago, whose opening had been delayed twice for reasons she had helped navigate. "Yes," she said. They drove out together in a car that Dominic drove himself, without a driver, which was something she had not seen him do before. The city moved past the windows the way it always moved, containing everything, explaining nothing, and they drove mostly in silence, the comfortable silence of two people who had been in enough difficult rooms together that silence had stopped requiring management. The facility was in a neighborhood where the streets were narrow and the buildings ran the full range from maintained to barely standing, and the new center sat among them with the specific quality of something that had been built to last in a place where lasting was not a given. It was not grand. It was solid. Clean lines, large windows, an entrance that was wide enough for equipment and did not look institutional in the way that communicated to the people who entered it that they were problems to be processed. June was waiting inside with 3 members of the program staff and a woman who ran community outreach for the neighborhood and who had spent 6 months working with the foundation on the design of the intake process, because June had understood from the beginning that a facility people didn't trust enough to walk into was no facility at all. They walked through it, all of it. The examination rooms, the consultation spaces, the small waiting area where someone had put a low table with things on it for children to touch and look at. Because whoever had thought about that detail had understood something about what it meant to bring a sick child to an unfamiliar place and the specific terror of waiting. Charlotte stood in the waiting area for a moment. She thought about what Dominic had said in their second meeting, about his youngest daughter, about a hospital in a neighborhood where most families couldn't cover the cost of what she received, about watching that for a year and then doing something about it without putting your name on it, because the name wasn't the point. She thought about her own father, about what he would have made of this room. She thought he would have approved of the table with the things on it for children to look at. She thought he would have found that detail quietly sufficient evidence of good intent. "It's right," she said to June, who was standing beside her. June looked around the room with the expression of someone who had been working toward a thing for long enough that seeing it complete still required a moment to process. "Yeah," June said. "It is." They stayed 2 hours. On the drive back, the city coming toward them from the north in the low afternoon light of late January, Dominic drove without speaking for a long time, and Charlotte sat in the passenger seat and watched the buildings pass, and felt the specific quality of the silence between them, the weight it had, what it contained. I've been thinking about something, Dominic said. She waited. When you walked into the Meridian building, he said, 4 months ago, you sat across from me and you were 29 years old and you had 12 pages of research and you weren't afraid. I was afraid, Charlotte said. You didn't show it. That's different from not being afraid. He was quiet for a moment. When I first came to this city, he said, I was 26. I had nothing except the ability to see how things were put together and the willingness to do what other people wouldn't. He paused. I spent 40 years building something. I lost most of it. Not to the market, not to bad decisions, to people I trusted. He said this without self-pity, which was the only way he said anything, as a fact with a history. I had stopped believing that trusting someone was recoverable, that you could do it again after it had cost you enough. Charlotte was quiet. And then you walked in, he said, with your 12 pages, and you told me the parallel, that we'd both been stolen from by the same method. He glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. I didn't believe you at first. About the parallel. I thought you were using a frame that would appeal to me. I was, Charlotte said, and it was also true. Yes. A pause. Both things. The city moved around them, the traffic thickening as they came further north, the light changing as the afternoon moved toward evening. I'm not asking you for anything right now, Dominic said. I want to be clear about that. What we've built in the last 4 months, the work, the foundation, that doesn't require anything else. That's real on its own. I know, Charlotte said. I'm telling you this because I think you've spent a long time having people want things from you and frame the wanting as something else. And I don't want to do that. Charlotte looked at the side of his face, the lines around his eyes, the jaw that had kept its structure, the gray at his temples, the face of a man who had been through enough that the surface of him no longer tried to be anything other than what it was. Dominic, she said. Yes. I know what you're doing and I appreciate it, and I want you to know that I'm not afraid of this either. She paused. Both things. He was quiet for a moment, and then, for the first time in 4 months, in this city that contained everything and explained nothing, Dominic Blackwood smiled. Not the almost smile she had seen twice before. Not the partial arrival of something that stopped short, but a complete and unguarded expression that changed his whole face and lasted only a few seconds and was entirely sufficient. He drove. She watched the city. 3 weeks later, Charlotte stood in the main corridor of the pediatric center on the morning it formally opened, holding a coffee she had stopped drinking because June was talking to her about the intake numbers for the first month, and the coffee had gotten cold while she was listening. The corridor was filling slowly. Staff, a few families who had arrived early, the particular organized, purposeful movement of a place that knew what it was for and was beginning to do it. A child was sitting with her mother in the waiting room, looking at the things on the low table, turning a small painted block over in her hands with the focused attention of someone who had found something worth examining. Charlotte watched her for a moment. She thought about the night she had sat at her desk after Victoria and Nathaniel's wedding and written 12 pages until 2 in the morning, running on coffee, and the specific clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. She thought about the lobby of the Meridian building, and the slow elevator and the man behind the table who hadn't looked up until he was ready. She thought about Soren's lab in the cold October morning, and the notary stamp that Marcus Blackwood had produced from his coat pocket, and Bridget Cho's voice on the phone saying 9:15, hard stop, and the text that said filed. She thought about her father's reading glasses, about the way he held the paper at an angle for the light. The child in the waiting room set down the painted block and picked up something else, a small sphere, smooth, that caught the light when she turned it, and looked at it with the same focused attention, wholly present, the rest of the world not yet complicated enough to compete with the simple fact of something worth looking at. Charlotte finished the cold coffee. She turned back to June. Tell me about the second-month projections, she said. And the morning continued, ordinary and sufficient and real, in a room that had been built to last, in a city that contained everything, while outside the windows January moved toward February, and the light came in at its winter angle through the glass, and fell across the floor in long, quiet shapes that meant nothing except that the sun was where it was supposed to be and the day was doing what days did, which was simply continue.